Hello, welcome to the India Story, the only show that brings you top stories from India for a global audience. I'm Vikram Chandra. India has just celebrated its Independence Day, which is always a day to dedicate ourselves to freedom. Not only freedom for the nation, which is of course the most important thing, but also for individual liberty and individual rights. And this year, a major step was taken just before Independence Day that could potentially have a significant bearing on individual freedom in India. The Modi government's introduced 3 new bills to replace colonial-era criminal laws. All of this in an effort to revamp India's somewhat creaking criminal judicial system. The purpose of these 3 new laws is not to punish but to give justice, said the Union Home Minister Amit Shah in Parliament. Now, at present, the bills have been sent to a standing committee for review. But on this show and on other shows to come, we will have detailed discussions on various aspects of these new bills. And that's because we've long maintained that judicial reforms are among the most crucial pending reforms in India. And if we can take significant strides in that direction, it will be a big boost for the India Story. A special analysis coming up on this show and a discussion with one of India's top criminal lawyers, Sidharth Luthra. Also on this show, we discuss India's groundbreaking One Sun, One World, One Grid initiative, which can position India as a global leader in renewable energy transition. It has the potential to reshape global energy dynamics. We're going to be discussing that and other issues with Dr. Ajay Mathur, the Director General of the International Solar Alliance, a special guest on this program. And of course, we'll have all the latest updates from Chandrayaan-3, India's most ambitious space mission till date, which is now on its final leg of the journey to the moon. But first, a quick look at some of the other big stories that have been making headlines this week. The 19th round of talks between Indian and Chinese military leaders has concluded without any major breakthrough. The joint statement issued after the 2-day military discussions talked about the positive and constructive engagement between both sides. But hey, they always say that the talks once again failed to yield significant results in resolving the outstanding issues along the line of actual control. The discussion took place just ahead of the upcoming BRICS summit in South Africa, where Prime Minister Narendra Modi and the Chinese President Xi Jinping are set to participate. President Xi will, of course, also visit India for the G20 summit next month. So these talks are important. In a recent observation, a Supreme Court bench expressed reservations about government involvement in regulating the media. The court, led by the Chief Justice D.Y. Chandrachud, is hearing a petition from the News Broadcasters Association. The bench said it opposes government's pre or post censorship of media, but it also stressed the need for robust self-regulatory mechanisms, particularly due to concerns arising from the sensationalized coverage of various issues, such as actor Sushant Singh Rajput's death case. Self-proclaimed cow vigilante Bittu Bajrangi has been arrested and sent to judicial custody in connection with the communal clashes that broke out in Haryana's Nuh on the 31st of July. A case was filed against him on the 1st of August after a video of him set to a song with threatening lyrics went viral. Bajrangi and 20 others have been booked for allegedly brandishing weapons during a religious procession. And let me turn now to our special focus this week, 3 new bills that aim to revamp India's criminal judicial system. Let me start by telling you a name, Nikhil Chandra Mondal. It won't ring any bells. He's not a celebrity, he's not a politician. Mondal was arrested in 1983 and declared guilty of murder. This year, in March, 40 years later, the Supreme Court said that he was actually innocent. Here are 5 other names: Ambadas Bapu, Raja, Raju, Suresh. They were headed a death sentence and spent 13 years on death row. 7 judges and 3 courts, including the Supreme Court, called them guilty. Then in 2019, the Supreme Court said they were actually innocent. And then there's Jal Prakash, who didn't even receive a judgment. Investigators thought that he suffered from a mental illness. He still spent more than 20 years in jail without a trial. Why? Because there was no one to pay 30,000 rupees as a surety bond. A couple of months ago, a 90-year-old man was convicted and sentenced to life in prison for killing 10 Dalits. The crime took place more than 40 years ago, in 1981. The other 9 accused all died by the time the verdict came. And that still might be better than the case of the 1987 Malyana riots. After more than 30 years, a local court gave a verdict this April. All the 40 accused were declared innocent. Why am I telling you all this? Well, this week we celebrated our 77th Independence Day, a moment of great pride for all of us. We remembered how in 1947 we became free from foreign rule. But we also have to go on reminding ourselves, what exactly does this freedom mean? China is also free from foreign rule, but do the Chinese people enjoy freedom? Afghanistan's now been free from any foreign interference for 2 years, but freedom for common Afghans is actually shrinking every day. So independence from foreign rule is one part of being a free country, and of course it's the most important part. But, and it's an important but, safeguarding the liberty and the rights of the individual is the second part of being a free country. And if India's rank is 112 out of 165 in the Human Freedom Index 2022, it's largely because of a perception that we aren't doing as well as we should in that second part, when it comes to civil liberties, when it comes to individual rights. And that brings me to the criminal judicial system and to the 3 new bills that have just been tabled by the Modi government in Parliament. Now, those bills are now with a standing committee and will be debated at length before they hopefully become law. And that's good. That's really good, because if these laws are debated, if these laws are amended in a few areas, and if they are then passed by Parliament, they could be, potentially, they could be among the most critical reform measures that we've ever passed. And why do I say that? It's because the criminal judicial system in India has been broken for a while. And if the India story is to play out, we do need to fix the criminal justice system. And let me just give you some data to back what I'm saying. 76% of all prisoners in India are under trials. 18 lakh under trials enter prison every year, 1.8 million every year. Around 30% of under trials spend more than a year in jail. In January, Nalsa told the Supreme Court that there were 5,000 under trials still in jail despite having already got bail. In 2021, there were 5.54 lakh people in prison, while Indian jails had a total capacity of only 4.25 lakhs. These problems have been highlighted for years and years and years. This is nothing new. But last week, there was potentially a major development. And that's when Union Home Minister Amit Shah introduced in Parliament 3 bills to try to overhaul the criminal justice system. Now, these bills are aimed at replacing the Indian Penal Code, the Criminal Procedure Code, and the Indian Evidence Act. More than 300 changes have been proposed in these 3 criminal laws, and the Modi government said that its objective is to ensure the delivery of justice within 3 years. Speedy justice is at the cornerstone of this. Amit Shah has also said that the old laws were brought by the British to maintain their control on India. But the new legislation will safeguard the rights of people and have an Indian soul. So, the big question that all of us are going to be asking, and frankly, we need to go on asking this question, and we need to go on debating these, and we need to try and get the right amendments so that those stated objectives are actually met. Can these proposed laws actually fix India's ailing criminal justice system? And there's a lot to discuss on that, from women's rights to definition of crime to how individual crimes will be addressed. And in the coming weeks and months, we will discuss all of them, because this is really important. But because we are in Independence Day week and we are in the mood to celebrate freedom, let's today look at 4 aspects that concern individual liberty and individual rights. The first is swift justice, or what so far has been the lack of it in India's case. Let's face it, when justice is delayed, it ends up benefiting criminals, benefiting those who are actually guilty, and punishing the victims and punishing those who are innocent. Why do I say that? Well, it's obvious. The victims don't get any justice if nobody gets punished for something for 30 years or 40 years. But even otherwise, if somebody is accused of a crime, think about it. If that person who's accused of a crime is guilty, then the last thing the person would want is speedy justice. The person wants that trial to take 20 to 30 years because who knows what could happen in 20, 30 years. On the other hand, if that person is innocent, like some of those cases I gave you at the start of this particular discussion, then the last thing you want is delays. If you're innocent, you want speedy justice because you want it to be acquitted. You want that shadow to go away from you. So, speedy justice is more important than you think. Speedy justice helps the innocent and it hurts the guilty. And that's the way it should be. Now, what are the changes when it comes to speedy justice in the new criminal laws? One major change is the filing of zero FIR, which means the FIR can be filed at any police station and not the one near which the crime was committed. People can also file an electronic FIR. Now, this could make the process of filing an FIR and filing a complaint easier and less harrowing for people. Another new feature is that the police will now have to tell victims about the progress in the investigation within 90 days. That should hopefully create a system of police accountability to people. What remains unchanged is that investigators have 6 months to complete a probe in a summons case before a magistrate. But what is new is there is a specific deadline now for the filing of a charge sheet. A charge sheet has to be filed within a limited period. And once a charge sheet is filed, the courts have to frame charges against the accused in 60 days. They have to give a judgment within 30 days since the beginning of arguments. Now we have to see how this is going to work, but this could make a really big difference in ensuring speedy justice if those timelines are adhered to. It could also reduce the backlog of cases as we go forward. A major decision is to allow lawyers to seek adjournments for a maximum of 2 times. This will again hopefully end the era of tariq pe tariq. Now, one measure that could perhaps go either way is allowing a trial to happen even if the proclaimed offender goes on the run. On the one hand, this could provide quick closure to the victims, but on the other hand, it might make the police lax as they would go on even if they can't actually go and catch the accused. But it could help in getting some of those offenders back who've run away outside the country. Another new initiative, and it could be an important initiative, is the introduction of community service as a punishment for petty crimes. This could prevent jail time for non-hardened criminals and thus reduce prison congestion. Now, all of this raises, of course, some big questions as what happens if those deadlines for investigation, for a charge sheet and for a verdict are not followed? What actually happens? Does that mean those cases just fall away? Is there accountability? Can there be some way of making sure that those delays are not condoned? Also, what happens to old cases? Because let's face it, Indian courts currently have a backlog of 4.92 crore cases. So unless there's a system that the new bills help to clear the old backlog, it won't really help matters too much because we'll spend 10 years or 15 years or 20 years just cleaning up the old stuff before a new robust system can actually start to operate. So somehow or the other, we have to start thinking about, I don't know, like the Truth and Reconciliation Committee in South Africa, some way of clearing the backlog, perhaps dropping old cases which have been lying around for a long time and are not getting anywhere. Now, the next big factor that the new bill should be judged on is the entire question of arrest and bail, and this has been a major issue. If you've been following the news for the last 30 years or 40 years or 50 years, how you should arrest, should bail be the norm and not jail, those debates have gone on forever. Now, what has happened in these bills is, well, one move in the police's favor is that they can seek police custody of the accused, not just in the beginning, but at any time within 60 days of arrest. What remains the same is that a person accused of committing a non-cognizable offense cannot be arrested except under certain circumstances. A new provision is that the cops cannot arrest an infirm or elderly person accused of petty crimes without the approval of at least a DSP rank officer. This would hopefully protect a vulnerable section of society. Now, when it comes to bail, the proposed law reduces the number of cases where an under trial would get automatic bail if they have served half the maximum jail sentence under the alleged offense. However, The bill does add a new provision to give automatic bail to a first-time offending under trial who has served one-third the maximum jail sentence. And this hopefully will enable the releasing of non-history cheaters quite early. One other good thing in the bill is that the new bill strengthens the provision against torture to get a confession out of the accused. It adds more punishment for causing grievous hurt in such cases. Now, a big new rule is that the police have to do a video recording of their search and seizure actions, and the video clips have to be sent to senior officials. This, again, hopefully will increase police accountability and help to prevent the bungling of probes. Now, again, some big questions emerge from all of this. Do the new bills put into black and white what the Supreme Court has repeatedly said, that jail is the exception, that bail is the rule? And since 70% of all inmates are under trials, do the new bills actually make it easier for them to get out of jail? Now, the jury is somewhat out on this. If you talk to the experts, and we will be talking to them in a couple of minutes, they feel that perhaps this is where some of those amendments need to come in. Needs to become clearer. When should or can somebody arrest? When can and should somebody get bail? So we'll discuss that in just a couple of minutes. But let me carry on by giving you the broad sweep when it comes to sections of the law which have a disproportionate effect on civil liberties. Now, another factor which has been discussed at great length in the last few days is the entire question of sedition. The government has said that the proposed bill repeals sedition, and yes, Section 124A has gone, but others have said that, look, it's only happened in name because Section 150 is there right now, and now a lot of debate can happen as to which is better and which is stronger. The current law, for example, has punishment of life imprisonment or jail term extending to 3 years. The proposed law actually increases the period, but the definitions have changed a little bit. Terms like trying to bring hatred or contempt or disaffection are not there under Section 150. It's talking about exciting secession or armed rebellion or subversive activity. So there is going to be some debate as to which of the two is better. A certain amount of drafting changes will have to come because the explanation in Section 150 actually is incomplete. It's probably a drafting error which will have to be fixed when the bill comes up. So that's one big question that remains somewhat unanswered. Will all those special laws be kept? Will they be subsumed into the new Sanhitas? Or is something else going to happen altogether? I guess that is another subject for some debate over the next few weeks and months. And now let's get in the real experts in all of this. You know, it's a real pleasure now to be joined by somebody who probably knows more about criminal laws and what needs to be done to fix them than anybody else in the country. One of the top criminal lawyers we have in the nation, Sidharth Luthra. Sidharth, it's a great pleasure to, of course, speak to you. And while, of course, a lot of analysis will happen on the new laws and lots of discussion in the Standing Committee on what needs to be fixed, I guess to start off with, it has to be said that it's a cause of some celebration that a coherent, big, massive exercise is actually being done to try and reform criminal laws in India, because God knows it was long overdue.
So I'll tell you, Vikram, there are two parts which we have to consider this in. The first is there an attempt to reform the law? And I would say definitely there is. Is there an attempt to update the laws? Yes, there is. But having said that, the core of the penal code, which essentially is a law in 34 countries even today, and other countries have also played around with the sections, modified it, fine-tuned it, added provisions as we had in the past, is an exercise which needed to be undertaken because there were a lot of things in the existing code which needed updation. It's, after all, as you said, 160 years old. Having said that, what we must also understand is that if we wish to make a break from the colonial past, then are our laws liberty-oriented? Because the Constitution talks about Article 21. So are these laws regressive or liberty-oriented? And if you look at that, there are some issues where you see a lot of light. For example, community service is now a punishment, which is a very important move, according to me, because it takes the load off the prison system and makes an alternative sentencing possible other than a custodial sentence. That's a very important way forward. It's been done by courts on occasion, but that's only as an ad hoc arrangement, nothing, and that too under the constitutional powers of the Supreme Court. Having said that, what is important for us to see is, while we have added this provision, have we tinkered with one of the most important things, which is, have we expanded the scope of plea bargaining? Have we, like in the US, introduced offense bargaining? That is to say, a person who's accused of murder can plead guilty to a lesser offense, let's say grievous hurt or culpable homicide, and be given a sentence, but he or she is out of the system. So you reduce that many cases, which go through the gamut of appellate challenges. So these are issues which, according to me, it's a great effort made, but there's a lot more that has to be done.
I think you're absolutely correct. But the point I think which we should keep in mind is that now that these three bills have been introduced, there is going to be a process of debate, of change, of standing committee brought to Parliament, hopefully a lot of discussion. Experts like yourself and others will also come and give their further views. There'll be public discussion. And hopefully whatever changes you're suggesting will also be made. And hopefully at the end of the entire process, we will have moved towards greater individual freedom and individual liberty.
Yes, of course. There can be two stages which there can be amendments. One, the standing committee would look into the various provisions. There is also a likelihood that this matter, hopefully, I think this will go to a JPC. And finally, Parliament has the opportunity to amend the provisions. They're not bound by what the standing committee says. They will take that into consideration, but they can enact the provisions with changes. And we are hoping that our legislators will have a meaningful, comprehensive debate. Please remember one thing. What is the CRPC, the Criminal Procedure Code, which existed and which is now replaced by new law? It is essentially Article 21, our right to life and liberty in action. For the ordinary citizen in the street, what makes a difference is, can the police arrest me? Can the police question me? Can the police put me to detention? Can I be asked to confess? And that is the CRPC. And that is, as I would say, Article 21 in action.
Mr. Luthra, you're absolutely correct. And that's exactly why this is such an important process, because at the end of the day, if we are living in a free country and we've been celebrating Independence Day, as the citizens of a free country, you should have the ability to live as a free individual, where a state can't just come and take away your liberty or your freedom without a lot of things happening. So I'm just going to come to 2 or 3 specific points that we were just talking about, and which have not just now, for decades, a lot of these things haven't actually worked very well. So let's try and see how those can potentially be fixed. First of all, the power of arrest, the entire question of bail, the concept of bail and not jail. Now, these are things that we've been debating, I don't know, since I began my journalism career, 30 years or so, we've been discussing many of these issues. Are we anywhere closer in these bills to getting better systems, where you can't just be arrested and thrown into prison and kept as an under trial for 5 years, 7 years, 10 years, and then finally somebody says, oh yeah, you're actually fine, you're acquitted, go home?
So I'll tell you, there's a problem that is now foreseen as a result of these amendments. The bail provisions, the arrest provisions have really not been changed. And despite the Supreme Court in 94, in 97, again in 2022, coming down strongly in Antil's case, the government has not brought out a special bail act, which was something which we hope will come at some point of time. It would have been wonderful if it had come in this amendment. We had an era in the 1970s and 80s where we had a liberty-oriented jurisprudence coming from the Supreme Court, where bail was the rule, jail was an exception. In the 1990s, post-liberalization, that changed. And while there have been attempts to have it liberty-oriented, we must remember that there are different views that emanate from the Supreme Court, depending on at different points of time, because benches do not sit as one, they sit in separate benches of 2s and 3s. So there is sometimes variation in the view towards liberty. Having said that, what is important for us to see is this legislation allows police custody remand to be taken up till 40 days and up till 60 days, depending on the nature of the offense. What does that mean for an individual? That means that bail is theoretical. Practically, you will not get bail for 40 days or 60 days. In my mind, that is a serious curtailment of the right to liberty. And that's actually taking these provisions in the CRPC, which apply to non-serious offenses, as you may call them. That is to say, not that murder and all is not serious, but offenses against the state, for example, UAPA, NDPS, that's Unlawful Activities Act, Narcotics Act, and organized crime. Those offenses, those statutes allow for larger periods of police custody. Now, we've not extended the period beyond 15 days, but we've definitely allowed the police to take police custody, though for 15 days, either over a period of 40 days or 60 days. Practically speaking, that's a negation of the right to bail. That's a negation of the right to liberty.
So you're absolutely right that, courts do take very different views on the question of bail between benches of the Supreme Court, lower courts, high courts, often different interpretations that have been taken. So would you like amendments to come in these bills which would codify what the Supreme Court has often had to say on the subject of bail, that, unless there's some very specific reasons, bail should be the norm? Would you like to see that actually put into these Sanhitas?
Myself, the First Amendment I want before a codification of the law on bail, the First Amendment that I seek is a restriction on the right to arrest. Why arrest? The Constitution bench in Sushila Agarwal says a recovery made even in an anticipatory bail order is good enough. But in India, the problem is once arrest happens, and Vikram, I must blame some of you and your friends also for this. Once an offense is registered, a lot of people start baying for the blood of the person who's accused of an offense and saying, why is arrest not happening? So what do? You tell me.
Okay. In my own personal defense, I have very strong views on individual liberty, so I don't think I've ever exactly done that. But
I think people in your line of work say, don't they? And I'll tell you this, practically speaking, I've appeared in trial courts and even in the High Court, and judges have often had an off-the-cuff remark. I hope they're not influenced, but they often had an off-the-cuff remark. Isn't this the case we read about in the newspaper? And there are specialists in the police department who let out these morning press releases or the night before press releases, which are splashed all over the paper the day a matter comes up for hearing for bail.
Okay, so issue number one, the question of arrest and bail, and how does that get codified into the new laws? And the second question is the entire concept of speedy justice. And this is something which even Home Minister Amit Shah and the Prime Minister referred to repeatedly, including by introducing the bills. And let's face it, this is a really important question. Those prolonged delays we see in India, 10 years, 50 years, 20 years, case chala ja raha hai. It's actually good for somebody who's guilty because punishment is deferred, and who knows, perhaps that person can get himself or herself off maybe by paying something under the table. But it's terrible for somebody who's a victim. That victim doesn't get justice. It's terrible for someone who's innocent, because you can have a sword hanging over your head. You could be in prison. You may be under trial. And even if you're not, you're facing with an accusation that is hanging over you for years altogether. And then 20 years or 10 years later, you get acquitted. This is not correct.
Understand, everybody has the right of presumption of innocence. I must clarify, nobody is guilty to start with. The court has, you have to have a process. And you're right, delay often inures to the benefit of an accused. Having said that, we must understand one thing. 1898 code, 1973 code, all said trial must be done day to day. The one state where sessions trials happen day to day are, I believe, Kerala, where after the charge is framed, the matter is put down for trial, maybe a year and a half later, and then the trial actually goes on day to day. So two things. You can add as many procedures as you want. We don't have the manpower on the ground. We have not been able to achieve the 2012-13 recommendation of the Supreme Court to say have at least 50 judges per 10 lakh population. We've just not been able to do that. We say we brought it to 20, but the population has gone up, number one. Number two, we don't have the infrastructure. And let me give you an example of how it works. 75% of your high court positions are filled. 25% approximately are vacant. Similar is the position of the trial courts. We just don't have enough people, and the numbers have risen. In fact, in COVID alone, 2.5 years of COVID, we've had a 1 crore backlog added in cases.
So I just wanted to ask you a specific question when it comes to speedy justice. A lot of talk and headlines have been there about the new bills and the provision that a charge sheet has to be filed within X number of days, framing of charges then has to happen within X number of days, and then a trial. One of the questions that I think is somewhat unclear is what happens if that process doesn't happen? What if the charge sheet is not filed? What if the charges aren't framed in that much time? What happens?
The default bail is the consequence that was there in the early 1898 code, in the 73 code, and is there also now.
But that's only when someone's actually been arrested, then the question of default bail comes up. What if somebody's not been arrested, but charges have not been filed or charges are not being framed in the specific time? What happens then after that?
I'll tell you what, the time periods have been prescribed, but today there are the mechanism that needs to be addressed is charge sheets may be filed, but matters are pending for further investigation, which may be lingering for decades, for a decade perhaps. The Supreme Court had tried to correct this in Vinu Bhai's case to say you can't start the framing of charge till all the investigation is over. But that is followed in the breach constantly. And unfortunately, till we curtail the practice of filing inchoate charge sheets, and this is happening all the time. So in order to fulfill the mandate of the law, an inchoate charge sheet is filed. Let's say in Drugs Act, in a Narcotics Act, you file a charge sheet without the forensic report, which says it's a drug or a contraband. What use is it? And the Supreme Court is dealing with that issue even today. So till we address the issue that investigations must be comprehensive, not just formally complete, we will still continue to have the problem. So the change that is suggested is the way forward, but we will have to add substance to the provisions that have been brought in.
Now, Mr. Luthra, the other way to look at what you're talking about, the question of pendency of cases, because if that backlog doesn't go away, then it'll take, no matter how good your laws going forward are, if that backlog is still there, justice will be slowed down. So is there a time for some sort of a one-time audit or a waiver scheme? I mean, industry, for example, has been calling a lot about for a statute of limitations. If 10 years have passed or 15 years have passed, some old cases are lying around, close them and move on. Don't just leave them sitting around. Is that the sort of solution you think we need to think about as a creative answer to what we are facing?
So there are existing provisions where there are restrictions till when charge sheets can be filed. In certain offences can be filed till 3 years and not beyond. However, for offences punishable with more than 3 years imprisonment, there is no restriction till when charge sheets or investigations can be concluded. Thirdly, there is a 1974 law called the Economic Offences Inapplicability of Limitation Act, which allows certain statute, let's say Customs Act, etc., where there is no statute of limitation.
But isn't that the most obvious change to bring? One simple change, get a statute of limitations on all of that, introduce a statute of limitations that after 10 years or 8 years or something, those cases fall away. Half your cases will go, your pendency will come down, and justice can be speeded up.
But absolutely right. The Supreme Court sought to do this in 1996 and 98 through the common cause judgments, and then realized that they could not do it. And 7 judges in 2002 said, we can't bring in these legislatively judicially mandated guidelines or timelines. Parliament had to do this. That was 2002. We're in 2023.
All right, well, Parliament is now actually changing all these laws, so maybe that's something to consider. One simple change, and the other changes that we've been discussed, which can make 30–40% of cases just disappear and move on. Now, one last thing that I'm just going to discuss. There are lots of things to discuss on these bills, women's rights and others. I'll do them in subsequent weeks. But staying with the question of individual liberty and liberty-oriented issues, the entire question of special acts that actually exist, right? We've seen a lot of debate on sedition, which has been there, so I'm not going to reprise all of that once again right now. But a lot of people are also saying, what is the point of having an IPC that protects individual liberties if you then have 7 or 8 special laws from narcotics to UAPA to PMLA to what have you, and if you can arrest somebody under those and lock that person up for 3 years or 4 years for a cheating offense or for other offenses. So do you think somehow those laws now need to be brought into consonance with what is sought to be done with the criminal laws?
So the catch here is, Vikram, we've actually introduced to the new law offenses of terrorism, offenses of organized crime, offenses of corruption back into the statute. And we've not repealed those statutes. So we're going to have a situation which is going to create a dichotomy. Those statutes have reverse burdens of evidence. This Evidence Act does not. Until you amend those or recall or repeal those statutes, you have now two sets of provisions attacking the same crime. And that is a problem that will need to be addressed, and I hope it's addressed by the Standing Committee.
That's actually a very important point you're making, and that is again a very important thing that can be done right now, because it's there in the Evidence Act, for example. You can now put a lot of these into these bills and these criminal bills, so it is one set of laws, and then you can repeal all those other 10, 20, 30 laws that are floating around and say it's all covered by one particular set of laws that will govern all of it.
So my dream code, which I would have expected would be on the US lines, where all the central government legislation, all the union government legislations on criminality would be in one book, all the Evidence Act provisions in one book, and the procedural laws in one book. The reason is this. Look at the hapless sub-inspector or the head constable that has to go and look at different books to find which law does he apply on the same set of facts. And that is the reason you have procedural infirmities and prosecutions fail. So if you actually bring about those comprehensive laws, it's a win-win situation for the justice system, which becomes effective and faster, for the judges who have to adjudicate, for the lawyers, accuse and defense, prosecution and defense who have to adjudicate, and for the investigator. Today, the problem is there may be an offense, let's say mischief, under the IPC, but it may also be an offense of felling of a tree under the Trees Act. Where all does the investigator go, or the Environment Pollution Act?
Right, Mr. Luthra, I think we could go on and on, but we're going to have to leave it there for a moment. But hopefully this is a debate that will continue. Are you at the end of the day, though, optimistic? Because the fact that these three bills have come mean that there is that opportunity to have big bang reform and big bang change. I know in my entire career as a journalist, I've been hoping for changes in some of these things. I'm sure in your career as a criminal lawyer, you've also been hoping for the same thing. So a chance to get things put right now?
I think it's a step forward, and we should always welcome steps forward. But having said that, there are miles to go before we sleep.
Sidharth Luthra, thank you so much for joining us. So potentially big bang reforms coming in India, but as he was just saying, this will have to be debated, discussed, analyzed, maybe amended, maybe tweaked. But if the criminal judicial system in India can be fixed, and the judicial system in general in India can be fixed, it goes a long, long way in moving the India story forward. And our next segment today sheds light on India's groundbreaking energy initiative, the One Sun, One World, One Grid project. This ambitious endeavor, unveiled at the COP26 summit in 2021, aims to forge a transnational energy grid connecting nations across the globe. While India's vision for a cleaner and more sustainable future has, of course, been gaining a lot of attention, what are the challenges that lie ahead, and how does the initiative impact India's domestic policy? Let's face it, the entire question of solar power is becoming increasingly important. We've seen India's been able to meet many of its emission targets that it has been setting for itself. There's plentiful sun. So if we can actually harness the sun, it's going to have another major impact. But joining us now to answer some of the questions around solar energy, who better to talk to than Dr. Ajay Mathur, who is the Director General of the International Solar Alliance. Right, Dr. Mathur, thank you so much for joining us. Such a pleasure. Before I come to some of the new initiatives, let's talk about the International Solar Alliance, which of course is something that India has been really championing from the very outset. How's it going? Is it living up to its full potential in your view?
Well, we have 116 countries as members of the Solar Alliance. We have active programs in 55 of those 116 countries. We have moved from the membership being restricted to countries between the Tropics of Cancer and Tropic of Capricorn to everybody who is a member of the UN. All of this is because of the interest that people have in the mission of the Alliance, which is to make solar as the energy of choice in our member countries. We've also been helped by wonderful tailwinds in terms of the decreasing costs of solar that we have seen across the world. The challenge is that while there has been a decline in costs, while there has been an increase in the investments in solar globally, in 2022, the amount of money that was invested in solar globally was approximately $250 billion. This compares favorably with the amount that was spent in electricity production, even at the peak of the fossil fuel boom. So that's good, except that there is a huge skewedness that is hidden in these numbers. 70% of this investment has gone to the OECD countries and China. All of Africa is less than 3%. This creates a huge problem. The second skewedness is that the vast amount of this money has gone in for large solar farms, solar pumps, solar mini grids, solar home systems, solar rooftops have got much less money, probably less than half of what has gone for solar farms. Therefore, in order to make this as an energy source of choice for you and for me, it is important that we move money into countries where it is not going and into applications where it is not going.
If I could just try and understand what you described as the tailwinds, and those are important tailwinds. It's one thing to say we must invest in solar and it costs a lot more than petrol, or it costs a lot more than gas or hydropower or anything else. But when you look at the cost of solar right now, it's actually starting to compare, right? It's starting to become cheaper to have solar than to have fossil fuel.
Well, certainly where solar electricity costs, what, 2 cents a kilowatt hour? If you produce electricity from coal, it costs 3.5 cents, except that this production is when the sun is shining. So what happens at night? In countries like India, where the demand for electricity is still increasing, we have a problem of what do we do at night. Now, as long as you have adequate amount of thermal backup or hydro backup, that can meet the night demand. But till storage becomes cost effective, we have a challenge in ensuring that solar is available round the clock as the cheapest option. Now, if you compare it with, for example, diesel electricity, it's already cost effective. So for a lot of applications like cell phone towers, applications in island countries, applications in landlocked countries where diesel is the source, in all of those places, solar plus battery is already the cheapest option.
So if I could just understand how that would work for a country like India, I guess logically you should first try and get your neighbors, get South Asia on board, and then go further to the Middle East, to Southeast Asia, perhaps to Africa. Of course, some of our immediate neighbors are always likely to be somewhat difficult and somewhat challenging. So how do you do it? What is the way that this grid can be built out?
Now, yes, and more than that, actually. Because yes, we are talking of connections from India to East Asia through Myanmar. On the other hand, we are also talking of connections to the Gulf by a connector between, say, Mumbai and Oman. But as I said, there are other talks of grid interconnections also happening, the East Saudi Arabia-Egypt connection, for example, or within Africa between the East African and the West African power pools. So as far as India is concerned, the linkages on the East and the West make great sense. But they are not the only discussions that are happening. We are seeing a number of other discussions happening also.
Well, I guess one of the ways that this could be interpreted is that it's a really exciting renewable energy alternative to that whole One Belt, One Road initiative that is being put forward by China. Is it also being seen that way in countries like Africa, that this is India reaching out and the Solar Alliance reaching out with a really positive solution which we can use to try and solve the energy problem for everyone, which is a good thing for the planet?
So certainly there is a huge amount of excitement in the Europe, North Africa, India, Singapore, and onwards region. we have not yet seen a huge amount of excitement from the sub-Saharan African countries. That's something which is work in progress.
All right, Dr. Mathur, the International Solar Alliance doing some really exciting things out there. Let's see how that grid also pans out and shapes out. Thank you so much for joining us. And finally, it's a pride of India's space program so far and the country's most ambitious moon mission. Chandrayaan-3 is on the final leg of its journey to the moon. In just a few days from now, India will be either the first or the second country to have landed on the moon's south pole. In one of the most crucial maneuvers yet, Chandrayaan's lander module, comprising the Vikram lander and the Pragyan rover, has split from the propulsion module to continue its solar journey to the moon's south pole. It's expected to touch down for a historic moon landing on August the 23rd. Meanwhile, Russia's Luna 25 will also be attempting a soft landing on the lunar south pole in the coming days, and that's why I was saying India will be either the first or the second to actually achieve this. While the two missions are not going to be really interfering with each other, as they have different landing areas and they have different plans, it is going to be an interesting coincidence and a possible overlap of their missions. And for more on this, we're now being joined by Ajay Lele, who's a senior fellow at the Manohar Parrikar Institute of Defense Studies and Analysis, MP-IDSA. Ajay, thank you so much for being with us. So tell us what we can expect in the next few days when it comes to Chandrayaan-3.
I think so far the mission has been going in a very copybook fashion. It started on 14th of July. More than 30 days have passed. It's going to take another 4 to 5 days, expected to land on the moon surface on 23rd of August. If you see the entire journey of the moon, it is very fascinating. ISRO is able to achieve exactly what they wanted to achieve. Now, yesterday only, basically the separation of a lander system and the propulsion unit has already taken place. So now the lander system with a rover inside its belly is on the way to the moon.
Yeah,
now
but
what they have to do? Yes.
Sorry, I was just about to interrupt you to say, of course, all of us are very concerned about what happened in 2019. So I guess the moment of real stress is going to be when the Vikram lander starts to move, because till this point, everything was perfect in 2019. There were those particular glitches in Chandrayaan-2, which according to the failure report may well have been a software glitch. So is that when you'll be the most tense also, when Vikram is heading down?
You see, definitely at end of the day, anybody can say that we are 100% sure. But at the end of the day, it's rocket science and things may go wrong at any point in time. But so far, so good. It has done exactly the way it should have done. Let's wait and watch, because now the mission will be mostly in autonomous mode. So there will be hardly any sort of a readjustment or message giving from the surface of the Earth. Already ISRO has taken tremendous amount of precautions this time. If you see, they have undertook the mission in the 2019. Let's not count the COVID time, but still it has taken around 3 to 4 years. That means they have really worked hard on the mission. They had identified what were the problems during the 2019 mission, particularly from a point of view of doing a soft landing. And now they have ensured that the legs of the lander are stronger. The weight of a lander is also a bit more. Particularly, there were a certain amount of software problems which were felt during 2019. And because of that, the software was unable to take a decision at the last moment. This time, they have strengthened the algorithm. I think this is what is the key as far as ISRO is concerned. They have done a lot amount of a simulation exercise of checking on the possibilities of what may go wrong. And that's the way the algorithm has been built up. So even if there could be certain amount of a last minute glitches, I'm sure the software should be able to look at alternative solutions in a fraction of a second and take the corrective action.
Right. Last question. This entire thing which is capturing global headlines, the race between Russia and India to the south pole of the moon. Is this an unexpected development that we're in a space race with Russia? And does it look likely that the Russians could be winning that particular race?
Somehow I don't agree with this concept of a space race with Russia. Because if you recollect, India was supposed to launch the second mission to the moon in the year 2015, and that was supposed to be a joint mission between India and Russia. Russian space programs were facing certain amount of problems. That's why they were unable to provide us a lander and a rover system. Otherwise, Chandrayaan-2 itself would have taken off along with the Russian rover and lander system. It was a joint mission. So I think this is more of a coincidence that now Russian mission and Indian mission both are going to land on the southern pole. And over the period of time, particularly after the year 2008, 2009, when India's Chandrayaan was able to establish the possibility of a water on the moon, everybody is trying to understand more about where the water will be available. And South Pole obviously becomes a very good area where there is a possibility of a water. So Russia putting a mission on the South Pole, I think is from a scientific perspective, and India is also from a scientific perspective. Just because there is a coincidence that we are just landing 2 to 3 days here and there, one should not get into the zone of calling it as a space race.
All right, Ajay, thank you so much for joining us. We're going to be watching that particular landing with a great deal of interest, and we'll have more of it, of course, for you on the India story next week. Ajay, thank you so much for being with us. And that's all we have for you on the India story this week, but we'll be back again next week with all the big stories out of India, including Chandrayaan-3 and the latest updates on that. And we'll also have big guests and the top analysis on those crucial stories. That's it from us for the moment, though. Bye for now.